Behind an abandoned tire warehouse in Dayton, Ohio, there was a pile of garbage stacked against the back wall. Broken pallets, old tarps, crumpled cardboard. The kind of trash heap people walk past without looking twice. That's exactly what it was supposed to look like. But underneath the tar paper, there was a door. And behind that door, an Army veteran named Marcus had built a house out of wooden pallets, with a working wood stove, with gravity-fed running water, with a solar panel and a real bed and photographs on the walls. He had been living there for almost 3 years. Nobody knew. This is the story of how he built it, how he hid it from an entire city, and what happened when the demolition crew finally showed up on a Tuesday morning in November. Marcus started with the pallets. He told me later that big box stores in any American city throw away hundreds of wooden pallets every single week. Home improvement stores, grocery distribution centers, electronics warehouses, they stack them out back and pay companies to haul them off. Most of them just sit there for days before anybody bothers to move them. He knew which ones were safe. Heat-treated pallets have a stamp on the side that says HT, and those are the ones you can burn or live around without poisoning yourself. The chemically treated pallets, the ones marked MB, leach methyl bromide into the air over time, and you do not want to be anywhere near them in an enclosed space. Marcus had standards. He was building a home, not a poison box. He told me once he turned down 60 good-looking pallets at a grocery distribution center because every single one had the wrong stamp. He walked away empty-handed and came back a week later for a different load. He would go out at 3 in the morning with a shopping cart he had reinforced with extra wheels, welded onto the frame by a guy he knew at a mechanic shop on Wayne Avenue. He hauled pallets from 3 different sites on a rotation, so nobody at any one location ever noticed the same guy coming back. It took him 4 months just to collect the wood. 48 pallets in total. He stacked them, cut them, and bolted them together into a frame using bolts and screws he salvaged from construction sites along West 3rd Street. The walls ended up 3 pallets thick in some places, solid enough that you could punch them and your hand would hurt before the wall moved. Then came the insulation. Marcus had been a maintenance guy for a school district in southern Ohio in the 1990s, so he knew exactly what to look for. He would watch demolition sites during the day from across the street, just sitting on a curb with a coffee, taking mental notes. When crews tore down old houses, they would dump rolls of pink fiberglass insulation into industrial roll-off dumpsters. Marcus would climb into those dumpsters at night and pull out whatever was still wrapped or only partially damaged. He stuffed the cavities between his pallet walls with fiberglass bats and sealed them with plastic sheeting he had taken from a hardware store loading dock. He told me he wore long sleeves, gloves, and a bandana over his face every single time he handled the fiberglass. He said he had seen too many guys in the Army get sick from cutting corners on protective gear, and he was not about to ruin his lungs over insulation he was stealing from a dumpster. That was Marcus. Even his crimes had safety protocols. Over the outside, he layered tar paper and old tarps, black, gray, faded blue. He intentionally made the exterior look like a heap of garbage. Pieces of broken plywood leaned against the walls at random angles. Trash bags filled with crumpled cardboard sat on top. He even threw a few empty beer bottles around the base. Broken glass scattered in the weeds, the kind of detail nobody would think to fake. From 30 feet away, it looked like exactly what the city wanted to see, which is to say, it looked like nothing. I served 2 tours in Afghanistan, and I have been on the street myself for 11 years. I met Marcus at a soup kitchen in 2019. That's how I know his story. He did not trust me for almost 2 months. I would nod at him over the food line on Wednesday evenings, and he'd nod back. That was it. We were both Army, both quiet about it, both the kind of men who had learned a long time ago not to spread our stories around. Then one night in late May, he sat down across from me with a styrofoam cup of coffee and said, "You ever want to see something? I'll show you something." That was all the invitation I got. The next Wednesday, after the kitchen closed, he walked me 3 miles east through industrial back streets I had never had a reason to go down. The wood stove was the part that stopped me cold the first time I saw it. Marcus had found a small cast iron stove at a scrapyard outside Dayton, off Route 35, the kind of stove people put in old hunting cabins. He paid the scrap guy $20 for it, the only cash purchase he made in the entire build. He hauled it back on the same shopping cart he used for pallets, broke a bone in his foot doing it, and kept going anyway. He walked the last 1.5 miles with a cracked metatarsal and the stove tilting sideways in the cart. He set it on a base of cinder blocks inside the structure and ran a stovepipe up through the ceiling. Here is the genius part. He had routed the stovepipe through an existing ventilation shaft on the warehouse wall behind his shelter. So when smoke came out, it did not come out of his pile of trash. It came out of the warehouse vent, 15 feet up the brick wall. Anybody driving down that industrial road in winter saw a warehouse vent letting off a little steam in the cold air. Totally normal. Meanwhile, Marcus was inside burning shipping crate slats and broken pallet wood to stay warm at 20 below zero. The water system was where I really started to understand who Marcus was. He had hauled a 55-gallon plastic drum up onto the roof of his pallet shelter, using a homemade pulley system rigged from a section of rope and a piece of old galvanized pipe. He painted the drum flat black with spray paint so the sun would warm it during the day. He cut a hole in the top with a serrated knife and rigged a piece of rain gutter that ran along the warehouse roof to feed water straight into the drum every time it rained. From the bottom of the drum, a PVC pipe ran down through the ceiling into the shelter where Marcus had installed a kitchen faucet he had pulled from a demolished house on the east side of town. Turned the handle, water came out. Gravity fed, no pump, no electricity, just physics and patience. He even installed a small wire mesh filter at the intake to keep leaves and bugs out of the drinking water. Below the sink, he had a second drum that caught the gray water. Once a week, he would haul it out at night and dump it in the weeds 100 yards away from the warehouse, in a different spot every time so the vegetation would not grow in a suspicious pattern. He had a separate jug of bleach water for cleaning the catch drum, because he knew about bacteria, because Marcus knew about everything. The man had a system for every problem. He even had electricity. A cracked solar panel he had pulled out of an electronics recycling pile near the Greene County dump, the kind people throw out when one cell breaks, but the rest of the panel still works. The panel still produced about 30 watts on a sunny day. He wired it to a car battery he had taken from a junkyard, ran the connections through an inline fuse he scavenged from an old microwave, and from that battery he ran one LED light bulb that hung from the ceiling and a small AM radio that he listened to in the evenings. That was it. One light, one radio. He did not need more. Inside the shelter, Marcus had a folding camp chair and a sleeping cot with 3 wool blankets stacked in a specific order he was particular about. He had a small bookshelf made out of pallet scraps, and the walls were covered in photographs. Pictures of his daughter as a little girl in a yellow dress holding a popsicle. Pictures of his unit in 1991 standing in front of an Iraqi border sign. Pictures of his late wife sitting on a porch somewhere in Kentucky with a coffee mug in her hand. He had built a home in the most literal sense of the word. Not a hideout, a home. The first time I stepped inside, the smell hit me before anything else. Wood smoke, coffee, old paperback books, and something faintly like cedar. It smelled like a house, not a shelter. There was a small rag rug on the floor in front of the stove, a wooden crate beside the cot that served as a nightstand with a paperback novel sitting on top of it, a Louis L'Amour Western with the spine cracked from being read maybe 20 times. He had a coffee pot on the stove, and within 10 minutes of me walking in, he was pouring me a cup in a chipped ceramic mug that said "World's Best Grandpa" on the side. He told me he'd found the mug in the trash behind a Goodwill. He sat there in the orange light of the wood stove and told me about a winter night 2 years earlier when the temperature dropped to -18. He said the wind off the warehouse roof was howling so loud he couldn't hear the radio. The fiberglass walls held the heat, but the floor was cold concrete, and he'd had to layer cardboard and a piece of foam he'd pulled from a couch cushion just to keep his feet warm. He stayed up most of that night feeding the stove, watching the metal glow a dull red in the dark, listening to the wind, thinking about his daughter who lived 3 states away and didn't know where her father slept anymore. He told me that night he understood something. The shelter wasn't just keeping him warm, it was keeping him sane. Building it had given him a project, a mission, a reason to wake up. The Army had trained him to operate under conditions, to follow protocols, to maintain equipment. Now his shelter was his equipment. His routine was his protocol. The cold was just another condition. I asked him once how nobody had ever found him in 3 years. He laughed at me. He said the secret was making the outside look worse than the worst neighborhood in the city. The exterior was so deliberately ugly that anybody who walked past it looked the other way on reflex. Property owners, cops, kids on bikes from the surrounding industrial neighborhood. Nobody wanted to investigate a pile of garbage. The human eye slides right off something that looks like nothing. He also never lit a fire during the day. The stove only ran from about 10 at night to 6 in the morning, when the warehouse vent looked exactly like every other warehouse vent in an Ohio winter. He came and went through the warehouse's old loading dock, which had a busted padlock he'd rigged so it looked locked from the outside but opened easily from the inside with a specific tug. He timed the rhythm of the surrounding streets. He knew when the truck drivers came through, when the police cruisers patrolled, when the neighborhood was empty. 3 years, 3 full Ohio winters, and nobody knew Marcus existed in that back lot. I visited him maybe a dozen times between 2019 and 2022. He would make coffee on the wood stove. We would talk about the Army, about our families, about what the Veterans Affairs had promised and not delivered. He told me about his daughter Jenny, who was 31 now and a nurse in Lexington. He had not spoken to her in 6 years. He said he did not want her to see what he had become, even though what he had become was a man who could build a working home out of nothing. He never asked me for anything. He never complained about the cold or the hunger or any of it. He was the most squared away, homeless man I have ever met in my entire life on the street. Then in November of 2022, the warehouse got sold. A development company bought the whole parcel for an industrial conversion project. Marcus didn't know. How could he have known? He found out the same way the rest of us found out. When a demolition crew showed up on a Tuesday morning with a bobcat and started clearing the back lot. He was inside when they started. He told me later he heard the engines and thought it was just a delivery truck at first, the sound muffled by the pallet walls and the insulation. By the time he realized what was happening, the bobcat had already crashed through the south wall of his shelter, wooden pallets splintering, tar paper tearing, the wood stove tipping over onto the concrete floor with a sound he said he'd remember for the rest of his life. The photographs on the wall flying loose. 3 years of work coming apart in under 30 seconds. He came out with his hands up because that's what an old soldier does when something he built starts coming apart around him. The demolition guys called the cops called a social worker. The social worker called a shelter on East 5th Street. And in the 4 hours between when the bobcat hit the wall and when the social worker arrived, Marcus tried to save what he could carry on foot. The photographs of his daughter, his Army discharge papers in a Ziploc bag, the small AM radio, the Louis L'Amour novel from beside the cot, the chipped World's Best Grandpa mug. He left the wood stove smoking on its side in the wreckage. He left the water drum. He left the solar panel, the car battery, the kitchen faucet, almost everything he had built with his own hands over 3 years of an Ohio winter. The shelter they offered him on East 5th Street had a 60-day limit and rules about possessions, mental health screenings, mandatory chapel attendance, and a strict curfew. Marcus refused. He'd lived inside the system once before, in 2014, right after his wife died, and he said he'd never go back. He told me he'd rather be cold than be counted. He took his Ziploc bag and his radio and his coffee mug, and he walked away from the social worker on East 5th Street with the woman calling after him to please come back. I last saw Marcus in March of 2023 at a gas station off the interstate. He told me he was heading south toward Tennessee, where his sister used to live. He'd heard she'd moved, but he figured the neighbors might know where. He had a new backpack from a church donation and a pair of boots that almost fit. I don't know if he made it. I haven't heard from him since. Sometimes I think about him sitting in a Greyhound station somewhere with his discharge papers in a sandwich bag, and I wonder if anybody on that bus had any idea who they were sitting next to. Here's the thing nobody talks about when they talk about homeless veterans. The country that put us in uniform spent a lot of money teaching us how to survive. The Army taught Marcus how to insulate a structure, how to manage water in the field, how to maintain heat in sub-zero temperatures, how to disappear in plain sight, how to build something out of nothing in a place where nothing is supposed to exist. Then the country forgot we knew how to do any of that. They assumed homelessness meant helplessness. It doesn't. What Marcus built behind that warehouse in Dayton wasn't an accident. It wasn't a sad story about a desperate man. It was 30 years of military training applied to a situation the military never trained him to expect. A man with a wood stove, gravity-fed running water, solar electricity, and an insulated structure, all built from garbage other Americans threw away, living 3 feet behind a wall that thousands of people drove past every single day. There are men like Marcus in every American city. They're not asking for help. They're not waiting to be rescued. They're building, quietly, in the places nobody looks. If you knew where to look, you'd find them, but most of you never will.